que ya viene la revolución, para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando, ¡viva la revolución!
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
La bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito, nada.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 77, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda in Mainstream Media. Long live todos los mojados, los indocumentados, the immigrant community from Mexico, from Central America, from South America, from all over the world, coming in hot with some Los Tigres del Norte, talking about somebody being tres veces mojados, 3 times undocumented, 3 times mojado wet from crossing the rivers that you need to cross in order to get to the United States. A beautiful song, part of the revolutionary musical tradition of Mexico with corridos and storytelling, a beautiful song. And today we're going to be talking about the Democrats, something it's not anywhere in the news, by the way. Nobody's talking about this right now except for my homie, my comrade, Abraham, who's joining us, talking about the Democrats' expansion of migrant detentions and deportations, how the government of U.S. President Joe Biden is spending trillions of dollars on immigration and customs enforcement, ICE. And we're going to talk about the rise of private prisons, family separations, and human rights abuses committed against migrants, and exposing the Democrats' hypocrisy in claiming to be pro-migrant while simultaneously locking up and displacing them. And joining us today is my compañero Abraham Márquez, a revolutionary freelance journalist based in Los Angeles. Shout out to LA, where I'm speaking to you from as well. Abraham is a member of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists and a 2021 USC Annenberg Center for Health Journalism Fellow. Please follow him on Twitter. Link is in the description at Abe Márquez 3. And also check out his latest article. We're going to be taking a look at it as well during this episode for Multipolarista. Shout out to my comrade, Ben Norton, who does some really great journalism out in Nicaragua as well. Check out Multipolarista, and you can check out Abraham's latest article there. How's it going, brother?
Thank you for inviting me. I'm good. Thanks for putting some highlights onto this article.
Yeah, most definitely, man. And I think it's important to cover. I think it's important to cover immigration right now because a lot of times immigration only gets coverage whenever there's a Republican in office. When Trump was in office, it's all we heard about all day long. And that's not to say we shouldn't be talking about immigration and migrants, but it seems that whenever a Democrat's in office, whenever you have the liberals in charge of U.S. imperialism, there's no coverage of migrant detentions, of the separation of families, because it goes against their narrative as being those in favor of migrant rights, being in favor of maintaining families, keep families together. And so much crazy shit is going on. It's heartbreaking to see some of the images and videos that have surfaced about conditions in a lot of these jails, prisons, concentration camps. And a lot of the people who once were speaking out, AOC and Kamala Harris and Rashida Tlaib and all these other people that once were coming out hard and saying we need to abolish what happened to abolish ICE, or we haven't heard that. You guys remember that, like a year or two ago? So it's it's really good that you're covering this. And by the way, for those of you, shout out to everybody who's watching and listening. Shout out to Comrade Erica. Shout out to Comrade Ware Pilgrim, to Big Teal. Shout out to Big Teal, to Philly, to David Silberg, to everybody who's watching and listening. Abraham is somebody who I like talking to about immigration, because a lot of times within the coverage of immigration and migrant rights, it's framed as you have these poor migrants who are coming to achieve the American dream in the U.S., and they're fleeing conditions in their country because of innate characteristics of corruption, crime, poverty, violence that are happening there. But there's no responsibility on U.S. imperialism. And Abraham always brings it back to U.S. imperialism, to how empire is destroying our countries and creating the conditions for people to leave to begin with. And also talking about how fucked up it is for migrants once they get here. So he's always good to have on to talk about this. Before I pass it over to you, Abraham, to talk a little bit about your article, which the link is in the description, I do want to share a video that you sent me that I think is important to talk about. This is from The Hill. I'm just going to read some of the subtitles that are on here, because I think there's some really interesting information. Usually the Hill's trash, but in this case, they tend to have some pretty good info. Record number of immigrants funneled into alternative detention programs. We'll talk about what that is in a bit. The number of migrants being monitored under a surveillance program launched as an alternative to detention facilities has grown astronomically. A record 136,026 immigrants are now being monitored under Immigration and Customs Enforcement ICE. Way too fast. Under ICE's Intensive Supervision Appearance Program, ISAP. That's up from 86,000 who were under supervision in the beginning of the year. That growth has alarmed critics who say the program causes mental and physical harm to immigrants while doing little to divert them away from ISIS facilities. ISAP was launched in 2004 as a way to monitor immigrants in removal proceedings through a mix of home visits, court tracking, and electronic surveillance. The program has become a favorite of the Biden administration, which has tried to position its immigration strategy as a humane alternative to President Trump's. ISAP requires enrolled individuals to either wear ankle monitors, use a voice reporting system, or download an app called Smart Ink. The use of GPS tracking ankle monitors has brought particular scrutiny for the detrimental effects it has on the health of migrants. So that's record number of immigrants funneled into alternative detention programs. Abraham, can you break down what exactly is an alternative detention program?
Yeah, it's funny how when you read that last part, the language that they use, right, a more humane way of surveilling immigrants. And just to kind of backtrack a little bit on when you were talking about how under a Republican president, there's always a tension of how immigrants are treated. And then when you see a Democrat in office, not only does like the attention like disappear, but also that the language that the media uses disappears too, because you go from children in cages to now they're in facilities, right? Like they're in a better place, but they're still in a cage. The ATD program, the alternative to detention, it's something that I think we should continue to talk about, because Biden administration keeps funneling families and people in there. There's like over 200,000 people now in ATD, and what ATD is it puts more undocumented people under their watch, pretty much surveilled from ankle bracelets. And when you have an ankle bracelet, not only are you limited physically, but also work-wise, because you have to be at home and charging it. So sometimes you can't go to work, and if you know, undocumented workers normally work long days, long hours, so they're also limited. And in addition to that, more people that get into the ATD program, what that does is allows eyes to patrol your neighborhood, because now they know where you're at. They want to make sure that you're going from home to work. So that puts even more, I guess, occupational threat to immigrant communities. And it also, I think you remember during Obama, they had the Obama phones, right? And the Obama phones came with that app already on there. So it was a way to add people into that program and to know where they're at through GPS monitoring. So it's one of the most, I guess, authoritarian ways of tracking people. So that's what the ATD program is.
That's crazy. It's crazy you mentioned that. This is another article from NACLA. Back when they used to be better, they're fucking whack now on certain topics, at least. On Nicaragua, they're trash.
Venezuela,
but certain topics are good. Yeah, certain topics are good. I used to write for NACLA back in the day. And this is an article about ankle monitors used to track migrants from Honduras. So when I lived in New York, so I live in LA now. I was living in New York in 2013, 2014. I was born and raised there. And in the Bronx, in particular, in New York, there's a large community of Afro-Hondurans, of Garifuna people, who many of them are refugees exiled from Honduras because we know the 12 years of the coup government of neoliberal violence that has forced many people out of their land, privatization, extraction, all this stuff. And in the Bronx, you have a large community of Garifuna people led by women in particular. And one time I went to the Bronx to this church, this revolutionary socialist church in the Bronx by this pastor. He passed away, I think, a few years ago. I haven't been back since I left New York. And at this church, I went to this meeting of women from Honduras, Garifuna women, Black women. And you had a few dozen women with carrying children who just got to the U.S., who had these ankle monitor bracelets on their ankles, on their legs. And to me, seeing that shit was crazy, because it's like, the U.S. likes to talk about human rights violations and concentration camps and slavery in other countries. And here you have the U.S. empire doing this to people right in the belly of the beast, in the capital of capitalism in New York. Black women chained to these GPS ankle monitor systems. And this is what Biden is bringing back. This is the alternative, right? The alternate detention process, or whatever the fuck they call it. So this is happening now. Right now, as we speak, you have migrants, especially Black migrants from Latin America and the Caribbean, from Africa, from all over, who have these devices on their ankles. And I personally met several women with these, and that was a big fight. In Spanish, they call them grilletes. And that was a big problem. So this is an interesting article from NACLA that has more information. There was a protest. Here you have an image of some of the women with their children who also had from Dominican Republic, from Honduras, of women. This is Carla Garcia, a very amazing activist in New York who represents the Garifuna community. That was a big struggle many years, and now that's coming back with this ADP program. So it's just fucking crazy, right? But none of this is in mainstream media. None of this is anywhere in the news, because the Democrats are in power and they supposedly love migrants. But one thing I want to do as well, I just want to introduce the article that Abraham wrote, a really great article. I highly suggest you guys check it out. It is on, again, Multipolarista. I always have a tongue twister when I pronounce it. Multipolarista.com. Again, shout out to Comrade Ben Norton, who does really amazing journalism. This is Abraham's piece. Biden is expanding the U.S. government's brutal anti-immigrant machine. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, detained roughly 250,000 people in 200 jails in 2021. using brutal tactics to repress immigrants. This violent apparatus continues to grow under President Joe Biden. So I'm just going to read a few paragraphs and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. President Joe Biden and his top administration officials met on March 15th and signed a massive spending bill of $1.5 trillion into law. This package, which funds federal government agencies for fiscal year 2022, boosts military spending and increases discretionary spending for domestic agencies by $6.7 billion, the biggest increase in domestic discretionary spending in the past 4 years. The spending bill also expands the U.S. government's brutal deportation machine with an additional $284.7 million. I'm going to read it again, $284.7 million for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, which includes $57 million more dollars in funding for ICE's Contentious Enforcement and Removal Operations Office, known as ERO, which is responsible for detaining and removing immigrants. Overall, the Biden administration is funding ICE with $312 million more than the Donald Trump era average. Key sentence right there. I'm going to read that one again. Overall, the Biden administration is funding ICE with $312 million more dollars than the Donald Trump era average. So all this talk about the Democrats are, the party of immigrants and a nation of immigrants. Here you have them spending $312 million. Imagine what we could do with that.
Yeah, and then
lock up, detain.
Yeah, and they're adding more to the department that's specifically designed to remove people and deport them back to, a lot of times, to a place that they haven't even been to. So it's brutal.
Yeah, it's crazy. And then here you have a really good chart, tweet by Steven Semler, visualizing some of this funding. The expansion of these notoriously repressive agencies continues despite the fact that net immigration to the United States has consistently declined since 2016 and substantially dropped from 2020 to 2021, the lowest levels in decades. So immigration levels are declining, yet money and weapons and all this nonsense for detaining and locking up migrants has expanded. The 2022 spending bill provides funding to keep roughly 20,000 people currently detained by ICE behind bars. The vast majority, 70 to 80% of people held by ICE, have no criminal record. Many of those who do have minor offenses, such as traffic violations. According to court records, only 0.6% of new cases in 2022 resulted in deportation orders based on a criminal record. There are presently more than 1.7 million people waiting for immigration court hearings as the system experiences its largest ever backlog. They are stuck in limbo. I find that fucking crazy to me. The U.S. talks about government bureaucracy in socialist countries, and yet here you have this huge immigration court backlog.
And also, just to add to that, sorry to interrupt, but you're spending millions and millions of dollars, yet you can't hire enough people to process people's paperwork so that they're not in limbo and they're not living in fear and can just get their papers and be able to work and support their families.
Right. It's like it's crazy. Like, just the nonsense of it is ridiculous. And shout out to Comrade Flame of Liberation. Hey, comrades, all those synthetic leftists claiming we'll vote for Biden and then push him to the left and hold him accountable are proven wrong again. That's exactly right. They're nowhere to be. They're MIA. They're nowhere to be found, and nobody's talking about this. So I'm glad Abraham has been really putting this into context and providing the numbers. At the end of 2021, private prison corporation, the Geo Group, fucking evil motherfuckers. Geo Group is one of those companies that after a socialist revolution, their CEOs and their head people will definitely be sent on a one-way trip to the gulag. Geo Group signed a deal with the Charlton County in Georgia to expand immigration detention centers from 780 beds to 3,018 located in the city of Folkestone, which has just 4,464 residents. Down the road near Lumpkin, Georgia, is the Stewart Detention Center, which has a capacity of 1,900 detainees. The 2022 spending bill also includes an increase of $10 million for ICE's Alternative to Detention (ATD) program. This expands ICE's surveillance program in immigrant communities by patrolling their neighborhoods. So a lot of crazy stuff there. One thing, Abraham, what I wanted to ask you is talking about the private prisons and the detention centers. What are some of the big forces behind this? And in a way, I feel like they're making money from keeping people in limbo, right? Because the longer you can keep people in these facilities, the longer you can have more people detained, the more facilities you build, the more money you're able to make. Tell us a little bit about the connection between the private prison industrial complex and this increase in crackdowns on migrants.
Yeah, I think the one thing to also remember where we're at right now is we have President Biden in office, who was the architect of the mass incarceration bill, right? And as he's financing even more and more into ICE, into these programs, we know that he's looking to further expand these detention centers to surveil and detain people more. And like you said, it's very correct that keeping people in limbo and keeping people surveillance is a profit-making machine. These are all private companies that are providing this to the government, getting these fat contracts. In where we're at right now in California, supposedly there are not supposed to be any more private detentions or private prisons. You know, just about 2 hours northeast of here in the high desert, there's the Adelanto Detention Center that they're not supposed to expand. And that law kicked in 2020. But what they did in December of 2019, and what you saw a lot of them do across the country, is they signed fat contracts expanding, being allowed to expand. So even though the law kicked in 2020 that they're not allowed to expand, that doesn't even matter, because a month before they extended their contracts and they already bought up extra space in a different facility to expand. So you see the hypocrisy of the Democrats, you see the hypocrisy of the system as well.
And even just their ability to rebrand this as alternative, as good, as benevolent, it shows how their PR people, they understand, right? Because they understand once you attack the enemy, their enemy, the Republicans, their quote unquote enemy, as having kids in cages, they understand that they have to rebrand their image. And so they use these euphemisms like alternative to really hide what they're doing. Later on in the article, Abraham talks about the ICE and CPB deaths. This shit is crazy to me. Thousands of people wait while the U.S. government decides on their immigration status or the possibility of deportation. Some are held behind bars in inhumane conditions in crowded detention centers. In the fiscal year 2021, across the roughly 200 jails run by ICE, nearly 250,000 people were detained. Yet many people in the United States were not aware of the astonishing record ICE has of depriving people of access to lawyers, denying them medical attention, and separating them from their families. These abuses were highlighted in a Detention Watch Network report that showed how ICE refused to release people held during the COVID-19 pandemic, which threatened thousands of lives. It has been consistently demonstrated that ICE is unable and unwilling to properly care for people who require medical attention. Reports indicate that poor medical care has resulted in nearly half of all deaths in ICE custody. Crazy. Like, people are dying under their quote unquote care, and nothing is being said about this. ICE has officially reported 207 deaths of detainees since the agency was created in 2003, which in what is likely a very conservative estimate. Mandated by federal law to publicly report every detainee's death in their custody, ICE has used a loophole to avoid full accountability. This was a tragic case of this was the death of Oscar Lopez Acosta. While detained in an Ohio immigration center as COVID-19 spread around the country in 2020, Lopez phoned his wife to tell her that he was, quote, dying in silence. Lopez battled health issues such as diabetes and was worried about contracting the deadly virus. He had been in ICE custody since 2018 for re-entering the country. Lopez was released on April 24, 2020, with deteriorating health. On May 10th, he died on the couch in his home in Dayton, Ohio, left behind a wife and children, among them a 9-year-old daughter. I want to play a clip. this is about conditions in prisons and migrant detention centers. And then we'll talk a little bit more about what life is like for migrants behind bars.
Tick for me the things that you saw as a doctor in the facility that you felt were just inappropriate and wrong.
So the things that are concerning to me, number one was, of course, the lack of real significant sleep. The lights are on 24 hours a day, which we've said, which again, if this is a border processing center where someone is there for 3 days, not a huge problem. Yes, you were sleep deprived for 3 days. That was kind of not a fun experience, but I'm done. If this is a center where you walk in and people are telling you that they've been here for 3 weeks, and from the first day you see what your experience is like, you start to go a little crazy if you're in a building without windows for 3 weeks with the lights on. So that was number one. Number 2 and 3 is what I'm talking about with the human dignity and human decency is they're not allowed, well, not allowed, but there was no true access for hand washing and no access for washing their infants' bottles. If you are a mother, what you need to do is feed and clothe your infant, and you're in a space where you're not allowed to adequately feed and clothe your infant. I cannot imagine how demoralizing it is to have to feed your infant from a bottle with dirty milk. I mean, this building was designed to hold humans without any thought of the well-being of those humans, which is why I say it's as if they're holding animals.
Lawyers from the DOJ were arguing that having soap is not a requirement under Flores, which, as you know, is one of those legal decisions that kind of sets how you treat children who are held when they come across the border. I'm sure that you saw some of that testimony. Curious your reaction when you saw that.
I mean, the words in the Flores settlement, I believe, that it needs to be safe and sanitary. And she was saying that it was not in that to allow them adequate sleep, which we know from studies and we know from personal experience that sleep deprivation is significantly detrimental to your brain functioning, period. Forget about health. And it's actually a form of described torture. And I'm not saying that they were poking them in the forehead and not allowing them to sleep, but a thin mat on a concrete floor with bright lights. And so the trauma in the mothers is just by all of these things compounded. Yes, they already came traumatized, but now we're treating them with every form of disrespect. You can shower about once every 3 weeks. You're inside of a fenced cage, inside of a windowless warehouse with 24-hour lights on. You get minimal and not nutritious food. You get almost enough water. You can't wash your hands and you can't wash your formula bottles, and everyone is sick. And of course, you don't want your child to get sick.
Crazy, crazy stuff. And by the way, mind you, this interview, this discussion by this doctor who visited these detention centers was during the Trump administration. But it's important to mention that not only is this still going on today, but it's worse. They're building more of these centers where you have the lights on 24/7. Kids are given literally an aluminum foil blanket that's thin as hell. They can't even sleep. That's torture, right? I personally can't even sleep with a little bit of light on, and they have the lights on the whole day for these kids. They can't get a good night's sleep. They're eating shitty food. They're separated from their families. They're all cramped in little cages, and nothing is being said about this by the Democrats. So crazy stuff. And also, last but not least as well, there have been so many reports about these people working in ICE detention centers who have been abusing and molesting children as well, sexually attacking them, raping children. And it's some really disgusting shit. And that has a long-term psychological impact on these children who end up going to places like LA, who end up going to places like New York with all this crazy experience. So Abraham, your thoughts and analysis of all that.
No, yeah. And the one thing to also talk about is in 2020, during not even national, the worldwide uprising against racism, I was actually in communication with some people that were detained inside the facility here in Adelanto. And because there was such a popular talk of defund the police, a lot of the guards actually took out their anger on migrants that were inside as a way to, like, I guess because they were scared that the system was going to collapse and they weren't going to have a job. So they, our people are constantly being brutalized, and there's no other word for it but torture. These are not humane practices. They're not humane. It's not a humane system, and it sucks that no one's really talking about it now under Biden.
Dude, it's crazy. I I've shared the story before, and I'll share it one more time. But just quickly, in 2012, what year is that? Yeah, 2012. I went to Honduras and I went to a leftist meeting of Libre, of Partido Libre, before they came into power, before when they were just organizing after the coup. And I met an amazing activist who was murdered, Margarita Murillo, and two of her children, Montserrat and Aron. And I met them in Honduras. We were at a meeting. We were eating fish and plantains and talking about socialism and talking about the coup and all this stuff. Fast forward a few years later, before I moved to LA, I was in New York, and one of my friends from back then hits me up and they're like, yo, Montserrat and Aron have been detained by ICE, by immigration, and they're at court here in New York. And it was just crazy for me to see that whole circle, that whole cycle, right? Like, I'm chilling with them in Honduras. Like, we're talking about politics. They're forced to flee because their mom was murdered by death squads connected to the government. They flee to Mexico. They cross into the U.S. The next time I see them is in New York in immigration detention court. And that shit was crazy to me because you see full circle, the connection between imperialism and migrant crackdowns. I wrote an article about it for Telesud back when I used to work for them. You can check it out. It's about exiled Honduran activist daughter. And I have a whole interview with her where she talks about it. So it's crazy to see that the international aspect. And even in your article, you hit on something that's very important. The Israeli military company Elbit Systems, which creates technologies to help spy on and militarily occupy the Palestinian people, is the same company that California Border Protection hired to build towers on the U.S.-Mexico border, this to surveil migrants and to attack them. Former Israeli Colonel Danny Tirza, a principal architect, explained the idea behind this mass surveillance. Quote, "It's not enough to construct a wall. You have to construct all the systems around it," unquote. This fucking psychopath, Danny Tirza. The move to further militarize the U.S.-Mexico border is fueled by propaganda and mainstream corporate media, which treats the border as a war zone. So you have Israel, this settler colonial project, Israel funding this technology to surveil migrants, to attack them with drones. I've seen reports about robotic dogs that have been tested in labs to try to be used against migrants. And so you have a Zionist, a parasitic state, Israel, using the same technology that they've been using against Palestinians and Arabs on occupied land against people also on occupied land in places like California and Arizona. So you see the connections there. Hopefully Abraham is not canceled for being quote unquote anti-Semitic for pointing that out, because that's one of the usual bullshit talking points they use. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, the connection between migrant rights in the Southwest and also the Palestinian liberation movement.
No, yeah, you can definitely connect the dots there. The occupational force that the border does. And then a lot of this is not like this wouldn't be allowed unless all the propaganda of weaponizing the border as a war zone, right? There's an invasion, these are terrorists, we're constantly labeled as drug dealers, we're labeled as criminals. And so that allows them to fund even more and more weapons into the border, just like they do with the Palestinians, right? They're constantly labeled as terrorists. So we have to protect Israel, we have to protect the Zionist project. So they use the same marketing schemes to further militarize the borders in Palestine. And the crazy thing about it too is that we're in LA, and LAPD and also the Sheriff's Department get trained in Israel. They get sent there to train with the IDF. And it's crazy to think that that's like our local law enforcement using these occupational tactics that they're trained over there. And it's crazy. And the one thing I also wanted to highlight in that piece was how the border is being militarized. If you I know we keep saying we're going to go down there, but once we go down there, I'll show you how you see every president leaves an imprint. We have the original tent, little fence there. Then you have the massive one, and you see all these cameras everywhere. There's even a side where when Trump was in office, because he kept talking about expanding the border, building the wall. there's an area where he spent like, I think $500,000 to build like 8 different prototype walls. And then like when I went out there with my cousin, you see Border Patrol like testing it to see which one's stronger or another, and like they like throw rocks at it, they're climbing on it, and it's just like, man, that's our tax dollars going into like these occupational walls. It's terrible. But some people in the area have they did some pretty cool art displays on there of like, of people jumping the wall or crossing through it. So that was a pretty cool thing to see.
That's crazy, man. And it's like you have the same people who are silent about all this, saying China has concentration camps in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, the poor. It's like, look at fucking 10 miles from here, downtown LA, not even 5 miles from here. And you have literally a concentration camp with detained migrants who are going through some crazy shit, So it's just like, it's infuriating to me whenever people talk about that. What I want to do is I want to share a clip about, this is an interview with some migrants who are on the migrant caravan or the exodus from Central America, in particular Honduras, who have been fleeing, just to give you a sense of like, who are the people? Because Abraham hit a key point, right? You have the settler colonial governments of the US and Israel portraying migrants and people coming in here, at least the right-wing, hardcore right-wing neocon sectors, portraying them as criminals, right? You have proof that the IDF and Mossad, the Israeli security agency, the spy network, they were funding all of these Hollywood movies that portrayed Arabs as suicide bombers. And that's fact. You can look it up. Maybe at some point in the future I'll do that. But Zionist influence in media and portraying Arabs and Muslims as self-exploding terrorists, like that is recorded. That is fact. And you have the neocons and the right wings also doing that, bringing up MS-13 and all this other stuff. So here are some interviews with regular working class people from Central America leaving their countries. And we'll talk a little bit about the conditions that people face, why people leave, and what life is like for them on their way here. Breaks my heart, man, seeing that stuff, hearing about these people, our sisters and brothers, because that easily could have been us, man. If my family would have stayed in Honduras, if your family would have stayed in Mexico, that could easily have been us going through that. Abraham, you've been to all over this region. You've been to Mexico, you've been to Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. Why are people leaving? What are the conditions that people are leaving from? And why is it that people are not leaving somewhere like Nicaragua, where we've also been as well?
No, that's one of the things I noticed too when you play that clip is they named all the countries right in Central America, but they left out Nicaragua because the conditions are a lot better in Nicaragua because of the socialist government. They provide housing, they provide education, healthcare. They're constantly investing into the country and building it up. So there's no point. There's not really much of a reason to leave unless they just want to leave. But it's the opposite in countries that are under the grip of U.S. imperialism, right? Like in Guatemala and Honduras. I actually, when I was in Honduras, we drove to Honduras from Guatemala, and we took one of the only routes where you see a lot of migrants, walking. We see vans full of people trying to hide and bob and weave from Border Patrol, from immigration enforcement. And people are leaving just like, the family said in that clip, is that there's a lot of violence. There's there's no jobs, there's no opportunity. The Airbnb that we stayed at, the guy told us, and I think I always remember this, is that there's no clean money to make. There's no safe jobs. Most of the jobs are going to be, in the black market or, drugs or whatnot. So then by doing that, you put yourself in danger, and you put your life and you put your family in danger. And that's why you saw that family say that, their cousin just got killed and they don't want to be there anymore. Because then, they might be next or whatnot. So, it's just the actual conditions that they're living in. That's backed by the U.S.
It's crazy. And you see that happening even to this day, like people leaving because there's no jobs, no opportunities. There's no way to survive. And a lot of this is fueled by the policies, the economic and political policies that are being imposed. For example, one of the main reasons why a lot of the people are fleeing Honduras is because for the 12 years under the U.S. coup government, the right-wing government of Juan Orlando Hernandez, who recently was actually just jailed and sent to the U.S. Drug trafficking. El Chapo Guzman even admitted that he helped finance his party's re-election campaign, deeply connected to the narco trafficking industry, international syndicate. And you have basically these drug dealers, drug lords running the country, privatizing everything and handing off the land, labor, and resources of Honduras to multinational corporations. In the North Coast in particular, you have a lot of farmers being displaced by multinational companies, especially palm oil companies, banana companies, Chiquita Banano, and all of these international finance institutions that are displacing people from their land, forcing people into the cities, compounded with climate change because you have increased desertification of the region. You have the dry corridor that affects Guatemala, on parts of Mexico as well, in Chiapas and Oaxaca, all the way down to El Salvador and Honduras, where a lot of coffee is grown. All these coffee farmers who have been surviving on subsistence farming for thousands of years are now being forced into cities because of climate change and because of privatization. And in those cities, a lot of times, the only jobs they can get is in crime and drugs or sweatshops. Those are really your options. And because of that, people are forced to leave. And so even though the U.S. imperialist system created these conditions, now they're being criminalized on their way to the empire, where the only place left where these resources are available for them to survive. So talking about that and saying that is just fucking crazy to me.
Yeah.
And it's insane.
And then also to point out, like, when you have people escaping, this type of grip from imperialism, right? We're labeled. We have so many different labels, right? Criminals, rapists, whatever you want to call it. So when you have people that come here from Cuba or come from North Korea, they're defectors, right? And they get all the attention. And it's like, look how bad the government is in Cuba. Look how bad the government is in North Korea or Venezuela or China, right? And they get all the attention. And yet we have thousands of people leaving because of our own policies. And no one talks about that at all.
Yeah, I like to call them red carpet immigrants, people who come from Venezuela or Cuba. Like, compare, it's just funny because I remember in college, there was some fucking gusano who was like, I'm a migrant too. I identify with the migrant struggle. And it's like this wealthy white Cuban from Miami talking about like fleeing communism. I'm like, you can't compare a wealthy white Cuban fleeing Cuba and socialism to like a black or indigenous person fleeing Guatemala or Haiti because of capitalism. It's just, to me, it's crazy. I want to play a clip. This is Kamala Harris a few years ago responding to the migrant caravan and Trump and kids in cages, contrasted with some of her more recent comments about immigrants. So I'll just play this real quick.
I want to play for you this audio that's leaked just recently, late today, courtesy of ProPublica. NBC has not independently verified it, but you've probably heard about it. We played it at the top of our broadcast. It is difficult to listen to, but I wanted to get your response. Take a listen. And Senator, since I know that you're on an earpiece and you join us from voting, I'll just read some of it on the translation. It's children screaming for their parents, saying, asking for their father for their mother, saying mommy. Then a Border Patrol agent identified by ProPublica says, well, this is a, quote, orchestra here. We're only missing a conductor. And another child then pleading, when could my aunt come and pick me up? I have the number memorized, not even yet understanding what's being done to them. Your response to this being what the policy looks like?
I mean, it's heartbreaking, Ari. It's heartbreaking. And it's unnecessary. It's really unconscionable. The American Medical Association, the Academy of Physicians and Pediatricians have all looked specifically at what's happening with these children being separated from their parents and have documented and have projected potentially lifelong trauma being caused to these children. They are innocent. They're innocent and they're being traumatized. Anyone who has parented a child or been a child, my God, the idea that we would be removing these babies from their parents, and it's not necessary. Ari, that's the thing that is so outrageous and maybe even compelling about this. It's not necessary. The law does not require it, and certainly ethics and morals don't require it. Why are they doing it? You know why they're doing it? Because it is exactly what they told us they would do. You know, Maya Angelou said that years ago. People tell you who they are. Listen the first time. They told us months ago that this would be a policy that they would pursue to create a disincentive, a deterrent for these folks and these families to come to our border, many of whom are seeking asylum, many of whom are fleeing the murder capitals of the world. Murder capitals of the world. And this is what we're doing. This is not reflective of who we are as a country. And it has got to stop. It really has to stop. And they've got to stop playing politics with this issue, Ari. They've got to, at some point, everybody has to say, you know what, I'm going to draw a line somewhere, and this is where I'm going to draw the line.
So she did not draw that line. And this is last year. This is, I'm going to show you a clip. Kamala Harris in Guatemala telling migrants and their families, do not come.
I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come. The United States will continue to enforce our laws and secure our border. There are legal methods by which migration can and should occur. But we, as one of our priorities, will discourage illegal migration. And I believe if you come to our border, you will be turned back.
So she changed real quick. She's like, do not come, fuck y'all. Crazy stuff. Your reaction, Abraham, the Democrats. Honestly, like, we talk about this all the time, how so many people, even the NGO industrial complex, the Democrats, they're so fucking good at co-opting and hiring people like us, young Latino revolutionary radical people, to join these fake NGOs to bring people back to the Democrats. What are your thoughts on that? Because, man, to me, it seems like the Democrats have a real stronghold on the quote unquote immigrant rights movement. And why do we need to separate from them?
No, thanks for playing those two clips. Just because of it kind of just supports our points as like socialists, that under capitalism, immigration is weaponized, right? Immigration is capital needs undocumented labor to allow them to make even more money, and we're seeing now just the contradictions of how Ukraine refugees are getting like this special treatment. They're allowed in. You see, when have you ever seen a president hold a black or brown baby, right, and actually feel something for them and talk about, like, I just saw the pain in their eyes or the struggle in their eyes. You've never seen a president hold a Haitian baby, a Guatemalan baby, a Mexican baby, right? They just leave them in cages. So you see this weaponization of immigrant policies, and then Kamala Harris too, for coming out, in Guatemala, saying that just don't come, right? And it's that when I saw that, I was pissed off. I was like, this is bullshit. Like, you have the power to change things for the majority of the world, right? To provide even better policy. But she's not doing that to Ukrainians, right? She's not going to Ukraine to say, hey, just don't come. There's a legal way to do things, or the right way to do things, because they use us as a political football when it's convenient for them. And the Democrats are I've read before, like, war gets smarter all the time, right? The way they fight wars, like we're seeing that right now in Russia, They're using the Ukrainians to fight the war. They're not sending U.S. troops. And I think they do the same thing when it comes to immigration, right? They use our own people to tell us, what's right or wrong, right? So like, oh, you got to believe him. He's a Mexican, right? He's telling you what's right or wrong. And they get smarter and they get figure out creative ways to tell us that we're wrong and that we should do things better.
I feel like a perfect example of that is AOC. I feel like she plays the role of that token, imperialist token, very well. And I say role very intentionally because I feel like politics is theater, right? Washington, D.C. is a stage. And anybody who takes that shit seriously, in my opinion, you got to think twice about that because it's a theater. It's Hollywood. One thing that I always say is D.C. is Hollywood for ugly people, for imperialist uglies. And it's a place where they control our minds with these two fucking whack-ass parties, Democrats and Republicans. And they'll have somebody come on the stage like AOC. They'll hype her up. They'll be like, oh, she's so amazing. And her role and her lead, her script within this play called the U.S. Imperialism is to bring people like us back to the empire, right? Because around the time that she came out, there was a large group of people, especially black and brown youth, who are moving towards socialism, moving toward communism, and beginning to question both parties, beginning to be like, fuck ICE, fuck the U.S. system in general. And she came in basically appropriating those talking points, right? She came in initially saying like abolish ICE, and she came in talking about socialism. She's obviously, Puerto Rican. She's a person of color. So it's like she came in with all the right imagery and symbols, but then her role is to bring us back to the Democrats, bring us back to this two-party system. I'm going to play a clip. This is her talking about kids in cages and concentration camps. And we'll talk a little bit more about the role of tokens in U.S. imperialism.
The United States is running concentration camps on our southern border. And that is exactly what they are. They are concentration camps. If that doesn't bother you, we can have, okay, whatever. I want to talk to the people that are concerned enough with humanity to say that we should not, that never again means something. And that the fact that concentration camps are now an institutionalized practice in the home of the free is extraordinarily disturbing. I don't use those words lightly. I don't use those words to just throw bombs. I use that word because that is what an administration that creates concentration camps is. A presidency that creates concentration camps is fascist. And it's very difficult to say that because it is very difficult to accept the fact that that is how bad things have gotten. But that is how bad things have gotten.
A lot of the concentration camps she's talking about, the migrant detention centers, were created under the Obama administration. That's number one. Number two, as you mentioned in your article, Abraham, Biden's administration, the Democrats, are building even more of them with new advanced technologies, with more surveillance. Where the fuck is AOC? Where is she talking about kids in cages and concentration camps now? So I think this is a great example of why we got to stop falling for these fucking tokens, man. It's just great. Like, to me, like, I remember when Bernie came and then AOC and Rashida Tlaib and now this Supreme Court Justice, Ketanji, and like, they always have these actors come in and play the role of the radical minority, to come in and bring us back to their system. And it's like, when are we going to stop falling for this shit? It can be very frustrating.
Yeah. And then you saw also those terrible commercials from the CIA to diversify their department and have like these indigenous women, like these black and brown people. It's just like, come on, man. It's like we can't fall for it. We got to call them out, for what they are. And yeah, I'm glad you played that clip too, because like, where's she at now? Right?
Yeah.
People are still in cages. People are still being detained. Even more and more people are. And there's no outreach at all. because what they say is like, if you don't support the Democrats, then who are you going to support, right? And it's just, they're just the like they say, the graveyard of the social movements.
Yeah, and they use a lot of postmodern ideology because one of the elements of postmodernism, of liberal postmodernism, is removing class. There's a term that a lot of the rad libs use called economic. What is it called? Economic reductionist, or you only care about economics. And to a certain degree, there's an element of truth to that, right? There are sectors of the left, especially a lot of white dudes, who only focus on class and can be very insensitive to racial or gender or sex issues or national struggles. And I totally agree with that. However, the rad libs, they do the complete fucking opposite, where they're like, economics doesn't matter. If you're, Black, trans, LGBTQ, disabled, head of the CIA, then that's progress, right? If you're a trans Latina in the CIA, that's progress, right? But it's like, what they do with this postmodern ideology is by totally removing class, by totally removing imperialism, they can put these actors of these identities and have them into key positions of empire to win people over to these institutions, to be like, oh, I want a seat at the table. I want to be part of the CIA and the military and all this shit. So it's just really interesting for me to see who falls for it and why, and how this spell is used against people like us to keep us within this two-party system. And I think AOC is a perfect example of that. And also the Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown, I think her name is, like, how so much attention was put around that. This is progress. This is a seat at the table to see that. So it's just crazy to me. But Abraham, any final comments that you want to make, related to immigrant rights, or related to like the Democrats and the detentions and what's going on? Maybe anything also that you want to talk about related to May Day, because tomorrow is May Day, International Workers' Day. So anything you want to mention on that?
Yeah, in Central Valley, the farm workers are uniting a May Day rally, a day without a trabajador, as they call it. They made a pretty cool flyer, so that there's going to be a mass march in the Central Valley of farm workers and agricultural workers. And then just one final point that just piggyback off of what you said about, using, our people to push their agendas. Like, what's like I had a friend tell me once, like, yeah, we have to support them because they're our gente. I'm like, well, what's the point? Like, if they're going to continue doing the shit that everyone else, like every other white guy has done, what's the point? Like, it's good for them, for their career, for AOC, for Biden or whatever. But if they're continuing to terrorize our people, to terrorize our communities, separate us and separate children, fuck that. We got to support our own people and not support the system.
Exactly, dude. I totally agree, man. I have met a lot of people like that, even so-called socialists and communists, who are like, oh, I'm like, well, aren't they a Democrat and aren't they campaigning for like imperialism and shit and all this? And they're like, no, but they're still us, man. We still got to support them and defend them against Trump's racist attacks. I'm like, man, like, it's just crazy to see how diluted a lot of people have become in liberal ideology. And that's why I always hit the liberals the hardest. A lot of people will say, like, oh, how come you don't go at the Republicans or the conservatives as hard? I'm like, at least for them, they're outwardly fucking fascist, right? They're outwardly pro-capitalism, imperialism. The liberals are so fucking good at deceiving, at lying, at stealing our words, stealing our language, stealing our everything, our aesthetic, and repackaging it and bringing us back into empire. So it's important even more to debunk their nonsense and their craziness. So it's always good to talk about that. I'm glad, please everybody check out Abraham's article on Multipolarista. The link is in the description, and please follow Abraham on Twitter. Has a lot of great content from his travels throughout Central America and Mexico as well. Highly suggest checking that out. Thank you so much, man, for joining. It's been a pleasure having you on, man. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me, man. It was a pleasure.
And for sure. And thank you to everybody for watching and listening. I appreciate your listenership, your viewership. I hope to have more episodes like this soon about some of the shenanigans going on under the Democrats and other nonsense that they're doing. We're going to go out to some, one of my favorite songs actually from Rebel Diaz about migrant rights. Peace out, everybody. Have a great Saturday and take care.
Chile, a Bolivarian galaxy, that will be the illest. Welcome to my world, the people's universe. Let's have a conversation that'll make your soul search earth. Mother, it feels good to say things that uplift the hood. For what it's worth, we've been here for a while. Follow the moon, take a walk for a mile in the shoes of the man that picked your fruit. I want access to schools, I don't want to join the troops. You came to my country, you brought the dictator. Gave him money and told him pay me later. So taste the tomato, whatever. The students, the farmers, working together. Pa'lante inmigrante, no a la guerra. Mundo mapuche, siempre, forever. Human being, I got feet, so I walk. If I can't eat, I'ma move till I find my piece of the pie. A dignified life. Wife and the kids deserve more than this. She waitress, he grave shift. Money keep on making it, bills keep on taking it. Spaceship ain't awaiting, but somehow I'm still an alien. Out of this world, outcasted, held captive by second-class status. The factories closed, ain't no jobs at home. Wall Street broke, so they blame scapegoats. Jose, not Joe, getting stopped by 5-0. How they become the border patrol, I don't know, but what I know is I'm here to stay. If they ask me for my papers, I'ma laugh and say
destroying the earth because by doing so, they stand to make large profits. Those destroying the earth only care about the accumulation